Since I basically used up all my behind-the-scenes factoids for my review of book number 1 of the Clone Wars Gambit duology, let's get into some lexicographical tidbits for book number 2. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the word siege is defined as a military blockade of a city or fortified place in order to compel it to surrender. According to the online etymology dictionary, the use of siege in a military sense can be traced to circa 1300 as an army sitting before a place. Considering that Lok Durd's droid army just sits outside Torbel for a good chunk of the book, I'd say the title is surprisingly well suited to the plot. Clone Wars Gambit Siege by Karen Miller was released on July 6th, 2010. As with the first book in the Clone Wars Gambit duology, I had never read Siege before. At that point in time, I was not particularly interested in the Clone Wars era, so while I eventually became aware of it, I had not read it until now. So first, a brief summary. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker have gone incognito to the separatist-occupied world of Lantebe, where they have discovered that the Neimoidian general Lok Durd has coerced a captive scientist to create a horrifying bioweapon, and in turn, Lok Durd now knows that there are Jedi on Lantebe. Unfortunately, events are at somewhat of an impasse, as Yoda is not able to send forces to rescue Anakin and Obi-Wan. And Anakin and Obi-Wan see no way of escaping from Lantebe as they hole up in a native town. It will be up to the two Jedi, as well as their comrades back on Coruscant, to liberate Lantebe or suffer the consequences. So book number 2, Siege, picks up right where book number 1, Stealth, left off. Anakin and Obi-Wan are fleeing the capital city in a ground car, which eventually falls apart, and they plummet down to the countryside and end up getting taken in by a small town called Torbel, which has a damatite mine and refinery, which is directly providing Lok Durd with the raw materials he needs to create his bioweapon. Since they got word to Yoda in the Jedi Temple back towards the end of book number 1, Anakin and Obi-Wan are just biding their time until they can escape and make their way back to Lantebe's capital. Meanwhile, on Coruscant, Yoda and Bail Organa and Padme are trying their hardest to, number 1, find an antidote for this deadly bioweapon, and number 2, get forces to Anakin and Obi-Wan to rescue them. Unfortunately, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine is there to pump the brakes on a fair bit of that. Palpatine is rather annoyed that Yoda undertook this undercover mission without letting him know, sending his future protege Anakin into danger. And he's also annoyed that Count Dooku didn't tell him anything about this. And since Lok Durd is not the most stable individual, he ends up escalating his bioweapon plans and unleashing a test run on Mon Mothma's homeworld of Chandrila. Lok Durd also locates where Anakin and Obi-Wan are holed up and sends droid troops to first kill and then later capture them. So let's get into the characters. There are considerably more characters than there were in book number 1, mainly because of the addition of all the townsfolk of Torbel. I was a little bit surprised by how willing most of the townfolk were to not just take in Anakin and Obi-Wan when they thought that they were fellow Lantebans, but once they knew they were Jedi, how they stood by them and no one tried to turn them into the droids at all. There's one character, Jacqueline, who repeatedly talks about giving them over to the droids, but she doesn't do anything. But on the whole, they're good people. Many of them die, many of them are wounded, and fortunately they're all evacuated off Lantib to Naboo, which I wish we could have seen a little more of because the ending of the story felt a little abrupt, but I'm glad they were going to be sent to a new world that's hopefully much safer than the one they were originally from. Bail, meanwhile, is struggling with, I guess, just the reality of war, how he doesn't feel like the things he's had to do leave him the same man that he was before the Clone Wars begin, and he wonders if that's affected him for the worse. Yoda ends up telling him that while he's had to do things he's never done before, deep down inside, he's still the same person. He still has the same priorities and the same morals, and years of war, at least thus far, have not changed that. Bail also guesses that Padme has something going on with Anakin and goes, oh boy, that can't be good. He's also deeply conflicted about what's going on and how they should inform Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, and in fact how Supreme Chancellor Palpatine is responding to these events. In book number 1, he agreed with Yoda that they should keep this from Palpatine, but now in book number 2, seeing how Palpatine doesn't want to pull any forces to rescue them, despite everything that Anakin and Obi-Wan have done for the Republic, leaves Bail feeling very conflicted. I think even Padme, who's been Palpatine's #1 supporter, has a few moments of doubt here where she starts to wonder, what's his agenda and why is he doing this? Of course, I don't think either of them fathom the levels of manipulation that Palpatine's engaging in. They still think that he's just trying to do what's best for the Republic. But if it hadn't been for Taria Damsin's arrival and General Grievous's retreat, I don't think this would have ended well for Anakin and Obi-Wan. Yoda, meanwhile, bears so much weight on his tiny green shoulders. He doesn't want to leave Obi-Wan and Anakin behind to die, but also there are higher priorities, other things they have to worry about. I think if the Clone Wars has taught the Jedi anything, it's that they are not military leaders. They have no experience with this, and they're caught in a catch-22 of trying to serve the Republic, but trying to also serve the Force, and there's no good way for the Jedi to do that. I did find it odd that Yoda can't see any visions of the future, but apparently Palpatine can meditate on what's happening with Anakin on Lantib and go, oh, he's going to be okay. Really? I guess the dark side really has clouded everything if Sidious can see the future and Yoda can't. I like the addition of Palpatine's point of view in book number 2 because I feel like it adds an additional dimension to our understanding of his character during the Clone Wars, that yes, he has machinations within machinations, but because he's having to rely on so many different, disparate people, he has to deal with stuff like Lok Durd. Unleashing a bioweapon on Chandrilla, and Lok Durd trying to kill Jedi. I think that Palpatine believes that Dooku has a lot of the separatist factions in hand when there's too many people with different agendas here, and it's hard to keep track of them all. And so while a plan can start out going in one direction because of people's egos and personalities, it can end up going completely somewhere else, and then Palpatine has to intervene. It reminds me a little bit of Outbound Flight, where Palpatine signed off on Outbound Flight because he wanted to get rid of Joruus C'baoth and some others, and then when he realizes that Anakin and Obi-Wan are aboard, he's like, oh, shoot, that's not part of my plan. I said in my review of book number 1 that I hope that we got to see more of Ahsoka in book number 2. Not really. She spends time with Taria and Damsin. She sort of takes a leadership role among the other Padawans, and they put together these training exercises for them. And then when she's dispatched to Lantebe with the 501st, she can sense that Anakin's down there and she wants to help him, but we don't really see any of that until the very, very end. Taria Damsin continues to feel like a fanfic character to me. I think it's the way that she's slowly dying of a fatal illness that makes her feel especially reminiscent of fan fiction. Yoda eventually dispatches her to Lantebe to sneak her way in and destroy the facility that's creating the bioweapon. And she does that, and she encounters the captured scientist Dr. Fhernan, who has realized that the Jedi saved her family, and feeling bad about what she's done, she basically sacrifices herself to destroy the facility. This felt somewhat rushed, and I wished we had spent a little more time on it. We really only saw Dr. Fhernan briefly in here, and it was just to see how much Lok Durd is beating her and abusing her. So with that completed, with the facility destroyed, Taria heads down to Torbel, and she comes in, and she's going to help Anakin and Obi-Wan. But of course, the very act of her infiltrating Lantebe and then carried out these missions means that her illness is no longer in remission and she's going to die. Honestly, I thought that she was going to die within the story, but as we end, Obi-Wan says that she doesn't have much time left. And it also sort of felt like Taria was just here so that Anakin could meet her and then get mad that she and Obi-Wan used to have a romantic relationship, but nothing came of it, and now they're just really good friends, so then Anakin can once again rage about, well, then why can't I have Padme? Poor Anakin. Lok Durd spends most of the book basically almost peeing his pants in fear that, I don't know, Count Dooku's gonna come and punish him for what he's done. He rushes the rollout of the test on Chandrila, which kills thousands and thousands of people. He was going to unleash the bioweapon again on Bespin, but that seems to be thwarted with the destruction of the facility and then the creation of the antidote. And he flees to General Grievous. So he's still out there in the void, possibly could pop up again, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think Lok Durd ever makes another appearance. And then finally, we have the main characters here, Anakin and Obi-Wan, who are definitely put through the physical ringer over the course of this book, but are also put through the emotional ringer, because of course Anakin wants to save everyone, wants to save the village of Torbel, and at first Obi-Wan is the one like, we can't do that, we have to leave, I can talk to Bail, he can try to intervene at some point, but then the more enmeshed they become in this community, the more they both become involved in saving these villagers. Obi-Wan's not trained in Jedi healing at all, but he expends everything in trying to heal the people around him. And during the Theta Storm that begins in Chapter 8, when part of the shield goes down, Anakin uses the Force to keep the radiation out. And then once Lok Durd's droid forces arrive and they have to put the shield back up, this time so that the droids can't shoot them, Anakin's the one that's running around keeping everything running while Obi-Wan is helping, and also in the infirmary healing people. They're just run absolutely ragged trying to save this little town. And of course, tensions are very high during this. Already in book number 1, we had ongoing conflict between Anakin and Obi-Wan, that they don't have the same priorities when it comes to Lantebe. And here, we definitely see that Anakin still remembers Obi-Wan's initial behavior to him in The Phantom Menace. And it's part of why I think their relationship is so complicated, that Anakin craves Obi-Wan's approval, knows that if he were to reveal things that happened in the past, like the massacre of the Tuskens, or his relationship with Padme, that Obi-Wan would not approve of them, feeling like he can never measure up to the standard that Obi-Wan has set. Whereas Obi-Wan is like, Anakin is so full of potential, I shouldn't have been chosen to teach him, he should have had someone better, he should have had Qui-Gon. It's just a whole mess. I will say that despite them arguing with each other a fair bit, you can still see how much they love each other and how close they are. It's just, I think that Karen Miller, in liking to really dig into the characterization of characters, prefers it when everyone's on edge and just close to breaking point. Maybe because that's when the most dramatic emotional stuff occurs, but her characters can be quite tetchy and snappy. I had wondered going into book number 2, since I felt like book number 1 contained an awful lot of perhaps unnecessary setup, if you could skip just to book number 2 and get the gist of the story. Now that I've read book number 2, I'm not so sure. I do feel that characters like Dr. Fhernan really benefited from book number 1 because there's not much of her in book number 2. And also a lot of book number 2 is just characters stuck, unable to do anything. I did feel like the pace of the book was a little too slow. Because while I thought that certain sequences like the Theta Storm were very exciting, a lot of Siege is just people sitting around waiting for something to happen. Even once they're under siege by Lok Durd's forces, a lot of the book is them just sitting there, keeping the shield running, hoping the Jedi will come. And I just felt like the Clone Wars Gambit duology as a whole was just very slowly paced, which may be a consequence of what I'm guessing was initially the plan for one book getting expanded into 2, but I felt like the action scenes in Siege were somewhat lacking. And part of that was the way that Karen Miller just skipped certain climactic battles. When we get towards the end, we have Admiral Yularen and Ahsoka and Mace Windu and the 501st are confronted with General Grievous's blockade. And they end up pulling off this feint so that Taria Damsin can get her banking clan ship to crash on Lantebe, but it's an awful lot of them just being like, what do we do? And then we find out in the last chapter in the epilogue that they started attacking Grievous's forces, and then Grievous retreated because Lok Durd had fled up to him, and then they're able to land on Lantebe, and they're attacking the droid forces, but we don't see any of that. We just get Ahsoka landing on Lantebe by Torbel and finding Anakin and Obi-Wan and Taria, and they're alive. Same thing with the village of Torbel. The whole time it's that, oh no, we only have this much fuel left, so the shield will go down, the shield will go down. And we're there when the shield goes down, we're in Taria's point of view, and then we just skip to, they were able to hold them off until the 501st got there and many villagers died. And this rather reminded me of what Timothy Zahn would do at the end of the Thrawn trilogy in The Last Command, or at the end of the Hand of Thrawn duology in Vision of the Future, where you're building to this big space battle or ground battle, and then he just cuts to the last chapter and it's like, well, we beat them, go team. And you're like, I understand the impulse to not want to write a giant battle scene, especially when Karen Miller already had the Battle of Cothless in the beginning of book number 1, but I felt somewhat disappointed that we just skipped all of that to the end. I don't think we needed to have every nitty-gritty detail of those engagements, but it felt like cheating to just skip past it. I think that's part of what made the ending feel so abrupt, that you're building to something and then you just get a tiny bit of it and then you're in the denouement and it's like, going back to Coruscant, we're bros again, the end. And I felt like I wanted a little more wrap up than that, but I noticed that Wild Space by Karen Miller also had a similar thing of the denouement just not feeling enough for everything that she'd put the characters through. And then my final issue is in the your mileage may vary territory, but Karen Miller definitely exhausted Anakin and Obi-Wan and eventually Taria, both emotionally and spiritually and psychically and physically. And it reminded me of the approaches that authors would take in the Bantam era to how do we deal with Luke, who's a Jedi with so many abilities. Barbara Hambly in Children of the Jedi and Christine Catherine Rouche in The New Rebellion decided that the way they would deal with that is by exhausting him and injuring him and making him run on fumes for basically the entire book. And Karen Miller did something similar with Obi-Wan in Wild Space, so I think this is just how she operates, that she likes to put her characters through the ringer. And while I can understand the urge to take these characters and stretch them to their breaking point, at a certain point, I just feel bad for them. Like, how much more bad stuff can happen to Obi-Wan? He's passing out, he's exhausted, he's starving, he's dehydrated. Taria is dying, her disease is no longer in remission. And while I don't like superhero Jedi, I think that was my problem with some of Kevin J. Anderson's stories, where I stopped seeing Jedi as fallible human characters and they start to become like Superman. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, that's not my favorite either, because I don't mind reading war stories, but when characters are mistreated in this way, sure, it might be realistic, but it's not fun to read. And I guess that's just how I felt about Clone Wars Gambit as a whole. It's not fun to read. Yes, it's very slowly paced, but it's also filled with characters who are upset and scared and angry and frustrated, and there's not very much joy in here. So, in short, Volume number 2, Siege, concludes the Clone Wars Gambit duology. My favorite part of Karen Miller's books that I've read is how much attention she pays to Bail Organa, how much she fleshed out the relationship between him and Obi-Wan, so that when we get to Revenge of the Sith, we see how much the Jedi trust him. And yet Siege was also pretty slow pace-wise, and just absolutely stuffed with characters being put through a physical and spiritual ringer. Anakin and Obi-Wan give their all to save this village, and Karen Miller does some nice character work here, but I think that in the end, feel like the plot of the book matches up to the emotional drama that's going on. I'm just glad to finally lay this era to rest. So next time, I'm going to be reading Timothy Zahn's sequel to Allegiance, Choices of One.